Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all here. So, welcome to the 2023 ALPS Conference. My name is Jamie Humphrey. I'm the chair of the board of directors at ALPS. In my day job, I'm head of journals at the Royal Society of Chemistry. For the first time this year, our ALPS conference is a hybrid conference. And we spoke about whether we should do that or not as board of directors. And what was very important to us was that we increase the accessibility to our community to participate in the conversations and the presentations that we're going to hear over the next few days. Our ALPS community is a very broad one, and we welcome all of those involved in the publication of scholarly information from the many different types of organisations from around the world, whether you are from a traditional publisher, an organisation that may not call yourself as a publisher, but you still publish articles, or one of the organisations that's involved in supporting and working with the more traditional publishers. So whether you are joining us in person or online, I encourage you to participate fully in the conference over the next few days and make the most of this rather unique opportunity that we have here to make the most to meet new contacts and to reconnect with friends. On a related note, you might be interested in joining one of our new ALPS special interest groups. So this is a new initiative from ALPS, which brings together members of our community with similar interests to talk about particular topics. We've launched a number of special interest groups already, and details of those are available on the ALPS website. Going back to our conference and today, I want to say a really big thank you to Nicola Nugent and the whole conference programme committee. You've put together an amazing programme for us, and one that I know we're all looking forward to enjoying and participating in over the next few days. So thank you again, Nicola and the committee, and all our session chairs and speakers. We're looking forward to some very fascinating discussions this week. And to help us do that, particularly as a hybrid conference, we have our event app. If you haven't already downloaded it, I do encourage you to do so. There are some very useful features there to help us connect with each other. There's a connect and chat function, and this obviously works for anyone who's here or is joining us online. And there's another way to ask questions via a Q&A option on the app as well, which for this session, Nicola is going to be monitoring. So you can use that Q&A option through the app, whether you are joining us online or if you're in the room and would prefer to ask your questions in that way instead. Our conference this week wouldn't be possible without the very generous support of our sponsors and exhibitors. It's brilliant that you can support us in this way and help us meet together. So I'd like to call them out by name to thank them, starting with our platinum sponsor and sponsor of our Rising Stars Award, who is the PLS. Our gold sponsors, MDPI, Mercier, and the Royal Society of Chemistry. Our silver sponsors, Highwire Press, Integra Software Services, Carga, Silverchair, and Wiley Partners Solutions. And then our bronze sponsors, AAMC Convy, Aries, DeltaThink, KnowledgeWorks Global Limited, Creadocs, London Book Fair, and Scholastica. So you didn't come here this afternoon to hear me speak, so I will hand over soon. But before I do so, I need to do some housekeeping and run through some housekeeping aspects with you, so if you bear with me. And first, I would like to just remind everyone to be mindful of our code of conduct that we have for our events, and be sensitive perhaps to the fact that some people will be still uncertain and unsure about being in a physical meeting and in crowded rooms post-pandemic. All of our sessions take place either here, Deansgate 1 or 2, or next door over there in Deansgate 3. You have to exit and go through. You can't walk through the wall, obviously. All of our sessions will be recorded and may be used either the audio or the video versions online on a number of platforms. So I would ask that you avoid making any comments or criticisms of any named individuals or organisations. Coffee and tea and water are served in Deansgate Foyer, which is just the area outside there. The toilets are just to the right of the bar in that area as well. Lunch is served downstairs in the Podium restaurant. I think many of you will have gone there for lunch today anyway. There are no fire drills planned, so the hotel tells us, over the next few days. So if you hear an alarm, please move to your nearest exit. I can already see 2 here. They're marked throughout the hotel, of course. Smoking is not permitted in any of the bedrooms or in any area of the hotel. There is an area outside the main entrance where smoking obviously can take place. And I just want to finally finish off talking about the most important thing for all of us, which is Wi-Fi. If you haven't already worked out how to access the Wi-Fi, do talk to a member of the ALPS team. There are a number of ways to get to the same result, so do check. There are details of how to access the Wi-Fi also in the conference event app as well. And if it's your thing to comment on social media, please use the hashtag ALPS2023. But in general, if any of you need any help or any support or any advice during the next few days, please do speak to one of the ALPS team. They're generally found at the registration desk. They have yellow lanyards like this, and they'll be more than happy to help. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sarah Forder, who is the CEO of PLS, our platinum sponsor, who will introduce our keynote for this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. It is actually really my honour and privilege to be introducing our keynote speaker for this year's ALPS conference. And of course, we are very proud to be sponsoring it once again as a platinum sponsor. Dr. Elizabeth Gadd leads on research policy and culture at Loughborough University. A qualified librarian with a PhD in the copyright ownership issues of scholarly activities, Elizabeth has over 20 years' experience working in the field of scholarly communications as a researcher, librarian, and research manager. She's involved in several important committees. To name but 2, she chairs the International Network of Research Management Societies in Norms Research Evaluation Group, and she's also Vice Chair of the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment. With so much that hangs on research assessment and evaluation, it really is crucial that it's undertaken responsibly and effectively. So I really look forward to hearing about the progress being made to this end. Please join me, therefore, in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Gadd.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely warm welcome, and a very good afternoon to you all. Thank you so much for the honour of inviting me to give your keynote talk here at the ALPS conference today. My title is Future Trends in Research Evaluation. That would help if I got that slide up for you. I do need to issue a trigger warning at the outset that I will be talking about suicide in my opening slides. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to explore, firstly, what's wrong with research assessment, what's being done about it, how this might drive changes in researcher behaviour, and what might scholarly publishers do to respond to all of this. I'll be very brief on that because that's really your role. But hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to chat. I'd like to start, if I may, by introducing you to Stefan Grimm, a professor of toxicology at Imperial College London. He discovered a novel class of genes with the ability to specifically target human cancers, what we now know as anti-cancer genes. He was literally curing cancer. But that's not all. Stefan Grimm was a very caring man, a great mentor of an enthusiastic and multicultural team from 14 different countries, and deeply committed to all the projects running in his lab. He provided strong recommendation letters and never hesitated to make phone calls to help his trainees to get good jobs and advance their careers. He worked 7 days a week, preparing grant applications and supporting all his lab members to publish high-quality research. Stefan Grimm was one of the good guys. But the introduction of a grant income target at Imperial sent him the message that he was not good enough. And in 2014, Stefan Grimm took his own life because he was struggling to fulfill the metrics imposed on professorial posts. He was 51. It's perhaps no surprise then that when the Wellcome Trust did their landmark study to try to make sense of some of the stories from the coalface of research culture, that some of their key findings were about how competition trumped collaboration, revealing a very sorry picture of toxic, biased and stressful conditions fueled by metrics. It's also no surprise then that studies show that academics face significantly higher mental health risks than other professions, and that our PhD students are particularly vulnerable. Indeed, there have been 2 studies in the last 2 years on the high levels of suicidal ideation amongst our doctoral researchers, with 40% at high risk of suicide and 20% having an actual suicide plan. Given the toxicity of this environment, it is again no surprise that many are deciding to leave academia, often citing the poor use of metrics as a chief cause. This is Liz Morrish, who left the academy to become an independent scholar in 2017, writing this powerful piece as she did so about how the audit culture made her quit. Indeed, #leavingacademia is now trending on Twitter as researchers find that the pay, conditions and culture in industry surpass anything they've experienced in academia, including, I should say, one of your former ALPS conference keynote speakers, the geologist and all-round legend, Professor Chris Jackson. So I'm hoping that you can see a picture emerging here of the link between research assessment, research culture, and ultimately the sustainability of the academic research sector. And not surprisingly, this is one of the key drivers of research assessment reform, which a Global Research Council white paper defined as an umbrella term for approaches to assessment which incentivise, reflect and reward the plural characteristics of a high-quality research in support of diverse and inclusive research cultures. But let's dig into the detail a little bit and try to understand what exactly is going on here. What is going wrong with research assessment that is leading to such calamitous outcomes? If research assessment reform is about incentivising the plural characteristics of high-quality research, what is it incentivising at the moment? Well, this is data from a European University Association survey on research assessment practices in the transition to open science. And when asked what counts in terms of research career assessment, respondents overwhelmingly, 80%, identified research publications as very important in terms of being assessed for career opportunities. Bringing in grant money was second in line, but with significantly fewer, 57%, saying this was very important. But it's not just researchers who are assessed by their publications. This is what I call the research evaluation food chain, and it seeks to show the interconnectedness of all the stakeholders in the research assessment ecosystem. So we start with our researchers at the bottom of the food chain. They are our autotrophs, right, the ones that produce their own food, and they are assessed by universities and funders on their publication performance. But the reason that universities and funders do that is because they themselves are measured by funders and governments on those very same measures. In the UK, outputs form 60% of the REF, soon to become 50%. That's the UK Research Excellence Framework. In other countries, the reliance on publication performance in their national assessments is far greater. And why are funders and governments so interested in outputs? Well, because that's how they are assessed on the global stage by what I might call our apex predator at the top, the global university rankings. And how do we win at the rankings? Well, research shows 2 things. Firstly, brand recognition, also known as reputation surveys, and secondly, publication performance, citations. So not surprisingly, the life source of this ecosystem is, of course, our largely bibliometric data providers who sustain us all with a never-ending supply of citation data. So the evaluative methods used at the bottom of the food chain by researchers and universities, who are often the focus of calls to do research assessment better, are really just passed down from higher up the chain. And the accounting unit of scholarship is the publication. So what's the problem with evaluation systems that rely so heavily on publications? Well, we've seen some of the mental health and research culture impacts, but there are a lot of other issues as well. And one of the most important negative outcomes of publication-based assessment is that it skews the scholarly record. Because, of course, it's not just any old journal articles that get published, as you will well know, but those reporting positive results, those that have seemingly something to say. So this study looked at the cumulative effect of reporting and citation biases on what eventually ends up in the scholarly record. And they started, with all of the clinical trials registered on the left-hand side there rating to the treatment of depression, and those red dots on bar A on the left-hand side show the proportion of negative trials relative to those that had positive results, the green dots. The next bar along shows the proportion of those positive and negative trials that made it into the literature at all. The next bar shows the proportion of those published studies that actually focused on the negative findings. The next shows the proportion of published studies that put a positive spin on the negative findings. And the final bar shows which of those studies ultimately got cited by resizing the dots according to citedness. And from this, I think we can conclude that there's absolutely no citation glory, the tiny red dots on the right-hand side there, to be found in negative trials, no matter how absolutely critical they are to scholarship. And of course, this distorts our understanding of the world, as this study highlights, which shows that 95 out of 100 studies found no association between autism and brain region in this study, but 5 did find a false positive result. Of course, those 5 got published. So now when you do a search for autism and cerebellum, you find 1 negative and 5 supporting studies, which is deeply problematic. At the uglier end of perverse incentives driven by publication-based assessment, we have the increase in paper-milled articles, some of which take advantage of AI tools like ChatGPT to generate reasonable-looking but actually nonsense papers, which pass peer review through chance, mishap, or malice, with the increase of peer review rings, where editors often have guest-edited special issues, authors and peer reviewers all join forces to get papers published in record time and often in quite visible, highly cited places. The other questionable research practice we can put down entirely to publication-based assessment is the existence of guest, ghost, or gift authorship, something 29% of researchers report having experienced, where individuals are credited without having contributed or contribute without getting credited. Because if there was no glory associated with publishing, no concomitant financial rewards, there'd be absolutely no point in offering gift authorships and no economic basis at all for paper mills. Another problem with publication-based assessments is that they disadvantage certain groups, such as women. We know that women are cited less in academic journals. We know that women are cited less in the news. Women self-cite less, and this is on the decline. And women are less likely to collaborate internationally. So publication indicators already put women behind. I saw this on Twitter last year. I thought it might be quite pertinent to this group. This is a word cloud of the names of the editors of the 49 top economics journals in the Australian Business Deans Council ranking. Clearly, if your name is David, Robert, or John, you've already made it. But there are intersectionality issues here, of course. There's now a dedicated movement to cite black women due to their underrepresentation in the so-called scholarly record. Another huge group disadvantaged by publication-based evaluation is all our colleagues in the Global South. So this data shows the proportion of journals indexed by Scopus from the Global North, 81%, versus the Global South, 18.4%. And of course, Scopus data is used in many forms of research evaluation, not least the rankings. So scholars publishing in locally relevant journals will not get the visibility and advancement of those in the Global North. The other group negatively affected by publication-based evaluation are those in the arts and humanities, because the databases that we use for research evaluation are, of course, heavily skewed towards STEM subjects because they are the journal-dominant ones. So this study found in 2019 that every database they investigated indexed fewer arts and humanities outputs than all other subjects. And of course, another problem here is that where publication-based evaluation systems are open agnostic, they don't accelerate open access to the literature. So only 23% of papers in Web of Science in the past 5 years have a free version available. That's slightly old data. It might be slightly higher now. Of course, freely available arguably isn't open. So according to lens.org, only 10% of outputs in the past 5 years have a CC BY or CC0 license. But even as publication-based research assessment systems do insist on open access, such as the UK Research Excellence Framework, because we haven't broken this fixation with journal-based evaluation, folks are hedging their bets and seeking to publish in open versions of existing highly cited journals. So many journals, as you know, are transitioning to APC-based open access, which is in turn leading to a link between article processing charges and journal impact factors, as you can see from this data here from Heather Morrison and colleagues. So scholars who were once unable to read these journals through lack of funds are now unable to publish in them for the same reason. And for me, that is not truly open either. So hopefully we are now all on the same page as to the importance of research assessment reform. So let's have a think about how far we might have come on this important agenda. Well, this is a nice timeline, I think, of all the relevant declarations, principles and statements framing our progress towards better research assessment, and having just demonstrated that assessment reform is more than just a mechanism for enabling open research, I think it's interesting to see just how many calls for responsible assessment still have their roots in the sector's drive towards open science. But I think when many of us think about responsible research assessment, we think about things like this. So the one that's perhaps gained the most traction is DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, introduced in 2012, and essentially a backlash against the use of the journal impact factor to assess individual researchers or individual articles. Then we had the Leiden Manifesto in 2015, which is 10 principles for the responsible use of bibliometrics across a range of evaluative settings. The Metric Tide report came out a couple of months later than that, and that came up with 5 principles for the use of all research metrics, which were recently updated with publication of the Harnessing the Metric Tide report, or Metric Tide 2, as it's commonly known, late last year. In 2019, we gained the Hong Kong Principles for Researcher Assessment that are based around research integrity. In 2021, the INOMS group that I chair published the Scope Framework, which is not a set of principles, but a simple method for designing evaluations that actually allow evaluators to put those principles into practice. And I do have to name check Emerald Publishing here for supporting us with both piloting and publishing this framework. And in July of 2022, the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment, COARA, launched the Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment, which really stands on the shoulders of the giants who've gone before and focuses in on some of the key themes identified by its predecessors. So what are some of the key themes resulting from all of this work? Well, I'm going to run through 6 themes and provide some examples of how these themes are kind of working their way out in practice, with an occasional note of caution, I might say. Because when assessment reform is discussed, I think there's often this assumption that there is some kind of truth out there, that it's possible to identify the best researcher or the best university if we only just got our assessment mechanism just right. But the truth is that there is no truth. As we know from scholarship itself, there are not always right answers, particularly in the social sciences, which is what we're talking about here. All we can do is to use our best efforts that are to develop kind of fit-for-purpose evaluations that are honest about the uncertainty inherent within them, and ultimately that first do no harm. So one of the first most important themes, I think, that's emerging from the assessment reform work is the need to be value-led in our evaluations and to value a much broader range of contributions. So the scope framework has as its first step starting with what you value about the thing you're evaluating, rather than outsourcing those values to a third party or starting with the data that you have, often bibliometric data. Similarly, the Humane Metrics Initiative has a value-led approach to assessing research in humanities and social sciences, and the first commitment of the Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment is to recognise the diversity of contributions to research. Because, of course, not all the important outputs of research are publications, right? And I think we've all heard stories about how large digital infrastructures we all depend on frequently rely on small, critical, but often completely unacknowledged software contributions. As an example of how this is playing out in practice, in the UK now we have the initial decisions for the next national assessment, the REF, and the term broader contributions is mentioned 6 times. It wasn't mentioned at all for REF 2021. So it is broadening impact out to include engagement, broadening environment out to include culture, and outputs is broadening to include all contributions to knowledge, specifically encouraging the submission of a broader range of output types, such as datasets, software, and translations. And given that the proportion of non-traditional outputs actually fell from 6%, already quite small, in 2008, down to 2.4% in REF 2021, I think you can see why this is needed. The Hidden REF initiative has actually gone one step further and challenged institutions to sign up to their 5% manifesto, thereby committing that at least 5% of their submission to the next REF will consist of non-traditional outputs. And by non-traditional, I essentially mean non-text. I guess the note of caution to sound about this is that in our efforts to identify what we really value about research and researchers, we're going to find that we actually value quite a lot of things. And of course, the more we measure, the more time it takes, and the greater the burden on assessors and the assessed. And there is in the UK HE sector at least a lot of work going into reducing burden and duplication in the research ecosystem. So there's a tension between measuring what matters and minimising the work involved. The other thing that I've observed here is that whilst there's a lot of activity around valuing a broader range of things in our assessments now, what we're not so good at is putting enough value on those things so that they actually make a difference. There's no point measuring what matters if we're still heavily weighting the things that don't. So we add open research and collegiality to our promotion criteria without any proper plans to assess them or even the means to do so. We can add a raft of research culture KPIs to our existing research KPIs in the hope that it will, in and of itself, usher in a brand new research culture. It won't. We already have a research culture, and it's embedded and embodied in our existing KPIs. Adding new ones without displacing or at least reweighting those old ones won't achieve anything. Of course, if we are to deliver on our value-led objectives, if we're going to measure what matters, we need to be able to actually measure what matters. And we can't always do that at the moment. So a second theme of global assessment reform is to develop better data about the things that we value. And one of the Harnessing the Metric Tide recommendations was for a community-developed set of research culture indicators, enabling the community to use data for good. And again, this has also been picked up by the next ref, where research culture indicators are going to form 25% of the 2028 exercise. And of course, where there's a community need, there's a commercial opportunity. So perhaps, not surprisingly, we're now starting to see attempts to identify better indicators for the things that we value, starting with the bibliographic data that actually got us into so much trouble in the first place. So PLOS One were the first to market with their open science indicators, identifying machine detectable traits such as data sharing, code sharing, preprint posting in 61,000 plus articles benchmarked against a comparative PubMed Central data set. Of course, Digital Science recently introduced Dimensions Research Integrity, which again uses machine learning to identify so-called trust markers in the scholarly literature and allows institutions to benchmark themselves against each other. So whilst this all seems to be meeting a need, I think, again, there is a note of caution that we need to sound here. Specifically, can we actually trust the trust markers? I think one of my concerns here is whether we sometimes make too big a leap from data to wisdom on some of these indicators, bypassing the intervening sense checks. Is evidence of a data availability statement actually evidence of rigour, especially if it just says contact the author for the data? Does declaring a conflict of interest a trustworthy scholar make? And of course, vendors are not stopping there, and the latest product keeping me awake at night is Elsevier's recruitment dashboard beta, which uses publication data to make huge leaps, to my mind, from data about whether an academic has published with their PhD student to judgments as to, and I quote, how nurturing they are. Go figure. So yes, there is now a market for evidence of a broader range of contributions. It's natural to see bibliographic data as a source of evidence. It's global, it already exists, we're used to using it. But this is not without its challenges, and we need to preach caution about this. And I guess this concern about the lack of control and ownership by the research community over the data and indicators used to assess them has led to another theme for global research assessment, and that is to call for open, transparent, and community-governed infrastructures. So the Metric Tide and the Leiden Manifesto both have as key principles the need for transparent and open data collection and analytical processes. But the Kawara Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment, inspired by movements like the Initiative for Open Citations, the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, POSI, and invest in open infrastructures, have taken that one step further and stated that one of its core principles is the need to ensure control and ownership by the research community over critical infrastructures and tools. So we're now seeing a rise, particularly in EU-funded work, to provide these community-owned research infrastructures. We have the European Open Science Cloud, the Open Air suite of services, including Open Research Monitors. We now have 2 new projects that seek to improve data collection on open science particularly, but beyond as well, in the Opus and GRASP OS projects. Another theme emerging from the responsible research assessment movement is a real people centricity in our evaluations. The focus is very much on co-design and co-evaluation, making good on the nothing about me without me principle, and alongside that, this desire to put equity at the heart of everything we do. And I think the Humane Metrics Initiative says it all. Our research talent is everything, and it's in all our interest to ensure that all the talent gets a fair chance to participate and to succeed. For that reason, evaluating with the evaluated is one of the principles of the scope framework, and one of its most important stages is to probe evaluation designs for unintended consequences and discriminatory effects. And I could draw on any number of examples here, but this one's particularly close to my heart. This is a report written by the United Nations University about the coloniality and biases of the global university rankings, with a view to exposing their impact on global health inequalities. There have also been a number of boycotts of US News and World Report law and medical rankings due to perceived conflicts with institutional diversity and inclusion ambitions. So assessments that discriminate against certain groups are just no longer seen to be tolerable, even when, in Yale and Harvard's case, they serve them very well. And this leads me very nicely onto my next theme of assessment reform, which is to rethink the use of rankings altogether. This was the 10th recommendation of the Harnessing the Metric Tide report, and one of the 4 core commitments of COARA is to avoid the use of rankings to assess individual researchers. The Arnold's Research Evaluation Group has also done a lot of work in this space, including their most recent initiative called More Than Our Rank, which provides universities with an opportunity to highlight in a narrative statement the many and varied ways in which they serve the world that are not currently captured by the global university rankings, something a recent Dutch rankings expert group recommended to all Dutch universities to take part in. But it's not just university rankings that are coming under scrutiny. There's an increasing acceptance that, whilst we do so love to rank, don't we, as society, we only ever really need to rank if there is limited resource on offer. We need to pick a winner. But even research funders who do fall into the category of needing to pick a winner are recognising that true rankings, where you can, one entity is securely placed higher or lower than another, just aren't always possible, and as such are increasing the use of lotteries in funding allocation, accepting that there are usually a cluster of proposals that must be funded, a cluster of proposals that are unfundable, a very large cluster in the middle of a similar standard, and the only fair way to treat them is to literally put their names in a hat and draw out some lucky winners. And of course, this puts a whole new perspective on the case of Stefan Grimm, who we now realise lost his life, essentially, for not winning the lottery. And to institutions that persist in using grant income as a measure of success, we have to say, buyer beware. And of course, this move away from rankings and quantitative assessments leads me neatly onto my final common theme of new research assessment approaches, and that is a general move towards more qualitative narrative methods. So the second commitment of the Agreement on Advancing Research Assessment is to prize peer review over quantitative approaches, something they borrowed almost directly from DORA, and the 7th principle of the Leiden Manifesto is to base the assessment of individual researchers on a qualitative judgment of their portfolio. As a consequence, we are increasingly seeing narrative CVs displacing quantitative assessments in many settings, not only for research and fellowship funding, but also by institutions for recruitment, promotion, probation and appraisal, and prize awarding bodies, and so on. So the National Institutes for Health introduced their BioSketch quite a few years ago now, which invites applicants to provide a personal statement to outline their contributions to science alongside their employment history and so on. The Royal Society have their resume for researchers, which the UK Research and Innovation have used as a template for their resume for research and innovation. The Swiss, the Dutch, many other parts of the world are all developing their own forms of narrative CV. However, this is not without its challenges, and I think it's fair to say that scholars are really struggling to write these things. They're worried that firstly they have to tick every box, when especially as an early career researcher they may not have a lot to say yet on all of these things. Secondly, they have no idea what good looks like. There's no public repository of narrative CV entries, and even if there were, one assessor might be looking for very different things to another, which of course is the point, but it doesn't help scholars looking to predict their chances. It's also a real challenge for assessors, particularly because qualitative assessments are a lot more challenging than data-driven ones, but especially so when you have 300 applicants for a single post. How do you assess these things at scale? There are also concerns more broadly about peer review, because whilst it's very easy to criticise quantitative indicators and to hold peer review up as the gold standard of research evaluation, there's a lot of concern about peer review, right? About its quality, reproducibility, transparency, equity, inclusion, efficiency, and of course, as you'll know very well in this room, the lack of incentives to participate. And there's still a lot we don't understand about different forms of peer review: journal review, grant review, post-publication peer review. So whilst metrics are often criticised for not being able to replicate peer review outcomes, peer review itself doesn't replicate peer review outcomes. And if you've ever had a run-in with Reviewer 2, you will know what I mean. Indeed, in a particularly powerful indictment of peer review, Professor Alan Dix, who was a member of one of the REF 2014 panels, did a fascinating post-REF correlation between the peer review scores assigned by his panel and their citations, and found significant gender and disciplinary biases amongst panel members, which ultimately led to a recalibration of the unit's output scores. This led him to conclude that metrics might be rubbish, but people far worse. So that's all very interesting, but how is this all actually affecting our scholars? How might they respond to all of this work? Well, I think might is the critical term here for three reasons. Firstly, scholars are the least homogenous group on the planet, so they won't act as a pack, so you can't single-handedly predict the behaviour of them all. Secondly, not all regions of the world have the same commitment to research assessment reform, so local policy settings will make a big difference to local scholarly behaviours. And thirdly, where countries are committed to reform, we're still very much at the early stages here, so we have very little evidence as yet for behavioural change. However, on the principle of Campbell's law, that what you measure is what you get, i.e. if you start measuring something, everyone's going to start focusing on enhancing that thing and ignoring other things to the point that we get more of what we measure, I think we probably have to look at these new ways that scholars are starting to be assessed to try and predict their future behaviours. But again, as we know, scholars are assessed in all sorts of settings for all sorts of opportunities, but the one reform that's really gaining the most traction, as I've just mentioned, is the narrative CV. So let's start here for an indication of the scholarly behavioural change we might start to see. So for those of you who've never seen a narrative CV, here's an example. These are the 4 modules required by the UK Research and Innovation's new resume for research and innovation. Other narrative CV approaches will vary, of course, but there are some common elements. So as you can see, you might just about be able to squeeze an output into Module 1, contributions to knowledge, but when it comes to the development of others and effective working relationships, contributions to the wider research and innovation community, and contributions to broader research or innovation users and audiences, and towards wider societal benefit, you really are going to have to dig a lot deeper than your existing CV. So let's take each of these in turn and have a think about how they might affect future behaviours. So the first thing prized by narrative CVs is, as I say, this contribution to knowledge. And as I say, whilst it would be possible to squeeze your journal articles in here, the expectation is that the range of contributions will go broader than that. So my first prediction about scholarly behaviour change is that we're going to see an increase in alternative output types, such as software, datasets, protocols, and a greater interest in evidencing different types of research contribution, such as through the credit taxonomy, but also the rigour and the openness of those contributions, so how the research was done, not just what research was done. And also, I think we're going to see a greater interest in communicating research results in different ways. So here in the UK, UKRI have funded a completely different way of communicating research results, as you may know, in the form of Octopus, whereby you don't wait until the end of your research project to declare your process and findings, but you do this in real time by first declaring the problem, your hypothesis, your methods, your data, your analysis, your interpretation, and then any applications of that research. And the fact that there are other alternatives to this, such as Research Equals and now a commercial offering from Cambridge University Press, suggests that it's an idea that may well gain traction. It'll be some way off, of course, but it could be a complete game changer in terms of both scholarly communication and ultimately the way research contribution is subsequently assessed. The second element of the resume for research and innovation focuses on researchers' ability to maintain effective working relationships. So So I think we're going to see a much greater focus on team science, on evidencing collaborations, on evidencing abilities to work in and to lead teams, where of course this is appropriate to the discipline. A concept developed by Ottoline Laser, Chief Executive of UKRI, is that of net contribution, where we should assess not only what we have done, but what we have enabled others to do. And given research is a very connected and collaborative endeavour, this feels very sensible. So I think we're going to move away from ranking contribution, are you the principal investigator, are you the first author, towards a view of scholarship that prizes the collective. Indeed, we're already seeing something of a democratisation of scholarship with an increasing number of joint first authors and researchers publishing under group names rather than as collections of individuals. And as we know, with the increase in hyper-authored papers, that will be very welcome. The third element of the UKRI resume for research and innovation focuses on these contributions to the wider research and innovation community. So this would include things like editorial board memberships, professional leadership, and of course, grant and journal peer review. Needless to say, this is a historically unrecognised and unrewarded work which causes significant issues in terms of journal peer review backlogs. The hope here then is that this will provide a greater impetus to do peer review, but probably only where some kind of acknowledgement can be gained for that service. Of course, the increase in open, pre- and post-publication peer review is one such opportunity. We have Clarivate's Publons, ORCID, other journal-specific peer review credit schemes that you'll all know very well. What you might not yet know is that one of the new Kawara working groups is focused on exactly this topic. How can we better recognise and reward peer review? So we're very much looking forward to the outcomes of that. The final change that might be predicted from narrative CVs is that scholars will be even more concerned to generate and evidence the non-academic impacts of their research. So clearly there is a global drive towards more impactful research. In the UK and Australia and Canada, they're really motoring on this, weaving it into their national assessments. The challenge has always been how to evidence it. Obviously, this is largely going to have to be qualitative evidence, but I predict we're still going to see the use of the scholarly record here, firstly through non-academic citations to academic work. So altmetrics have been around for a while now, allowing us to see if an output has been picked up by news outlets, social media, blogs, Wikipedia, etc., as a way of measuring non-academic attention. The former owner of Altmetric, UNAID, has left to set up Overton, which provides greater insight into where work has been picked up by policy. This underlying technology is now supporting services like BMJ Impact Analytics, which provides insight into clinical citations from BMJ journals. But it's not just commercial services that are offering these sorts of products. The fabulous lens.org has allowed scholars to see where their outputs have been cited by patents for quite a long time now. But the other way that the bibliographic record continues to be used to evidence non-academic impact is by showing that your work is in some way linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is an increasingly popular lens through which to evaluate impact. But again, not without its challenges, and I don't have time to go into those now. But so those are some of the expected and indeed hoped for changes that we might see to scholarly behaviour. But I think it's fair to say that right now there are still some anxieties amongst the scholarly community about all of this. And I think the first thing they're concerned about is a kind of fear of first mover disadvantage. So the Netherlands have famously led the world with their recognition and rewards programme that seeks to value a broader range of contributions to scholarship in funding applications. However, far from being universally grateful, there was quite a large contingent of unhappy researchers worried that by seeking to shine on these new measures, they might be disadvantaged when it came to moving globally into opportunities that might value more traditional success measures. Another set of concerns that researchers have about this move to more responsible forms of assessment is as to whether this is really just responsible washing. So beneath the apparent attempts to assess more responsibly, the traditional methods of yesteryear are still alive and well. And this might be due to the fact, as I mentioned before, that whilst we pay lip service to valuing a broader diversity of contributions, it's often still journal publications and grant income that hold the greatest sway. And this is certainly something UK academics are grappling with, as they're being encouraged to submit a broader range of contributions to the REF. And their fears might also be due to the fact that despite our best efforts to take the journal impact factor out of our assessment criteria, can you really ever take it out of the assessors' heads? And this was often an accusation levelled at REF panellists who were trained specifically to avoid journal impact metrics, but of course will be very aware of what those metrics are. And in a tiebreaker situation, it was wondered whether they could be relied upon not to let that knowledge affect their judgment. So, how might learned and professional society publishers respond to all of this, and what role might you play in the reform of research assessment? I appreciate that my talk today might be something of a tough message for publishers. Hearing that publication-based assessment may not be serving scholars in the same way that it might be serving them is hard to hear, but it's the truth. And if I've done my job today, I hope I've persuaded you, at least as fellow human beings, that as a research assessment regime that is at best too narrowly focused and at worst fatal is not going to benefit any of us. And whilst it's not really my place to advise how you might respond, I think there are three obvious domains which you might want to think about. The first is to consider your own role in moving away from publication-dominant forms of research assessment to valuing a broader range of things. What might that look like? How could you support a more rounded view of research and researcher assessment? The second is related, and that is to consider your role, any role that you might play, certainly for member-led organisations, learned and professional societies, in defining what it is we value about research and researchers. So the UK Committee on Research Integrity recently made a specific call in their annual statement inviting learned and professional societies to help develop discipline-specific definitions of rigour. Could you support that work? And thirdly, as those responsible for overseeing the assessment of research and readiness for publication, to consider whether there are ways that the peer review and selection processes you might use might be improved to bring greater equality of opportunity and higher standards, as I know that many of you already are. And I'm just going to leave you, if I may, with a montage of individuals who have declared their intention on Twitter to #Leave Academia, as a reminder that ultimately we have a duty of care here. This is our watch. If we want to create research cultures that allow the best and the brightest minds to be at their most creative, to innovate and fail, and to be rewarded for all the myriad contributions that make for a successful research ecosystem, then we need to get better at research assessment, and we need to do it now. We have an opportunity here, I think, to do something that our descendants will be grateful for, and I would urge everyone to play their part. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for an incredibly powerful talk, powerful message, I think, to everyone. There must be some questions in the audience. Elizabeth is very happy to take some. So there will be roving mics. If you could just tell us who you are and put your hand up with your question. And sorry, did I hear? Anthony's in the middle aisle. Someone can get you. Just if you could wait for the mic, thank you. Just remind us who you are and who you're representing.
Anthony Watkinson, Cyber Research. Elizabeth, this was fantastic stuff, and I totally accept what you were saying. But I'm just thinking, how do publishers work to convince the research communities that this is a good thing when they're so wedded with or even though they may complain about the current system? I'm thinking of the work we do with early career researchers, and although they are in theory very keen on the change, they in practice worry about it.
It is a real challenge, as I said in my talk. We've got researchers who understand the need for change, but are worried that they will be negatively affected by it. And it's certainly the early career researchers who are the most worried about it, because it affects them more than others who've already made it. So how would publishers work with those communities? Well, I guess perhaps you've just hit on another thing that publishers can do to support responsible research assessment reform there. Because you do have very good relationships with the scholarly community, and can make use of those relationships to support and work with those communities to develop alternative perspectives, alternative lenses on what good research and what good research looks like. What is it that we actually value about research? What is it that we actually value about researchers? And how can we go about recognising and rewarding that and ensuring that, as I say, all researchers have an equal opportunity to participate in that, in this world that most of us love so dearly and value so much. So thank you for that contribution. Yeah.
We do also have questions coming in online. Nicola, would you like to...
Yes, I think my mic's on. So we have a question submitted from Mitu Lucraft, who says, I would be interested to hear more about the support structures at institutions for developing these more qualitative evaluation summaries. Is there a role for publishers here?
In terms of the support structures within institutions, I think something that we are seeing being used a lot more by institutions is the scope framework that I mentioned. It's a very simple 5-stage framework that any organisation and institutions are using particularly to identify, for example, what is it that we value about research culture, and how can we go on to assess and evaluate that? What are our options, both qualitative and quantitative, for assessing that? What do we care about open research? And how might we then assess that? And the important probe stage, as I mentioned, will make sure that we don't kind of go down a route of assessing something that ultimately leads us into a worse place than we've been in before. In terms of the role of publishers in that work, is a more difficult question for me to answer. I think it's more of a question perhaps that you could reflect on over the next couple of days. But hopefully that answers the first part of the question at least.
Thank you. Do we have one from the room? Yes. Could we have a mic over here? We'll try and alternate between online and...
Mark Carden from Mosaic Recruitment and R2R Conference. Lizzie, you made a strong case early on about the failings of publications and authoring, I guess, and publications as a basis for assessment. And I'm a great supporter of moving away from that being perhaps the primary thing. But I wonder whether there's also a kind of opposite direction to go, which is to use research assessment needs to drive better authorship and better publishing. So if it could be an engine for better citations, better authoring, publishing in different ways, making publishing more diverse, I mean, that feels like one of the drivers that could cause us to improve publishing, peer review, authoring, and all those things by making it a kind of researcher-led, as Anthony was sort of saying, driver for why it would be good for researchers if publishing was a better indicator of research quality rather than being, on the other hand, kind of dismissed as an indicator of research quality.
Yeah, I mean, that's a view. I think that we have to be a bit careful that we don't use assessment to incentivise, as the only thing to incentivise behaviour change. Because, as I mentioned, authors, researchers are assessed in so many domains, in all sorts of walks of life, for promotions and prizes and jobs and grants. They assess each other. They're assessed by all sorts of bodies, and it is driving all sorts of issues within the researcher community. We don't always need to assess. We don't always need to evaluate. And I think measuring less has to be one of the the better outcomes, I think, of research assessment reform. So not assessing more and more to try and incentivise behaviours, but thinking about whether there are other things we can do to incentivise those behaviours, and to ultimately try and measure less if we can. But it's an interesting reflection. I think I will go away and have a think more about that, Mark. Thanks for the question.
Definitely one way publishers may be able to help. Nicola, could we have the next question online?
Yes, so this is a question submitted by Jennifer Wright, who asks, is part of the problem that there might be a difference between choosing whether to fund a particular research project versus choosing to fund a particular researcher for which narrative CVs may help? These are unusually closely coupled in academia.
That's an interesting comment, yeah. So seeking to fund research projects rather than researchers. And I think part of the problem with assessing researchers, of course, is that the usual suspects are always going to win. There's a Matthew effect at play. If you've done well historically, you're going to continue to do well in the future. Whereas if you're focusing on the research project and you're not so concerned about who the researchers are that are behind that particular project, you might give more opportunity to not the usual suspects, I suppose, but then you've got the issue of you want those researchers to be qualified, so how do you kind of marry the tension between the two? So, I think there are issues there to be resolved, I think, in terms of those tensions, but a good point.
So turning back to all of you in the room, do we have another question? So I've got a light shining in my eyes. Let's see. Is there anyone in the room with a question? If not, I think we've got one more online. So, Nicola.
Yes, so this is submitted by Bernie Folan, who asks, I find Lizzie's arguments compelling. It seems to me that the research culture described is deeply problematic. Can you share, Lizzie, a couple of defences of any of the discussed rankings that you've heard from any university or publisher that was hard to rebut?
You're asking the wrong person to defend the rankings. The only defence for the rankings I've ever heard that is kind of gained even a glimmer of support from me was that as university systems in some parts of the world, universities can try and leverage more resource into their university system by the fact that they are not, as a country, doing particularly well in a particular ranking. And I've seen that happen. I've heard of that happening. So getting investment into universities at all is the only defence for our current global university rankings that I've seen. As I mentioned, we only need rankings if we need to pick a winner. We don't need to pick a winning institution. Unless there's a prize on offer, and occasionally there are these prizes for institutions, fine. But they drive so many perverse behaviours that it's just completely unjustifiable to assess them and rank them in the way that we do. And of course that's particularly true for individual researchers. You might need to rank them for a job or a prize that's on offer, but as a general, I don't know if you've seen bestresearcher.com, and there's all sorts of these kind of rankings of individual researchers, including ISI's highly cited researchers, which ultimately just rely on bibliographic data because that's what's available to us to line researchers up and decide who's better than who. We don't need it. There's no justification for it at all. So we just need to move away from it altogether, in my view. But I might have quite an extreme view on that.
Yes, we have a question here in the front. The mic's just coming to you.
Hi, Heather Staines from Delta Think. We work on a lot of projects around research integrity, and it's become clear to me that the kinds of research integrity that the publishers are most concerned about, plagiarism, image duplication, multiple submission, that kind of thing, is not the same kind of research integrity that really drives the university behavior. They're worried about scandals and cuts in their funding. And so I'm just wondering, given the tendency for universities to sort of protect and defend researchers when things happen, like the university president at Stanford, are you hopeful that a lot of the things you talked about today, which are wonderful initiatives, can make progress up against all of the things that are weighted on the other side of the scale on the universities as to why they need to keep their existing system of assessment in place for their own university benefit.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And we see the same with university rankings, of course. They kind of intellectually understand the issues with them. But, if you're in the top 10, you're going to shout about that. And so there are these, there are always going to be things that work against initiatives that ultimately are trying to lead us into a better place. I think it's about kind of perhaps playing and changing the game to a certain degree, that we recognise that we need to move into a slightly different place, but the current place is kind of rewarding us, and so it's a kind of process of discussion and external drivers and internal drivers. This whole kind of people talking to people is about how norms and standards change, like a lovely quote from Atul Gawande. So I think we're not going to see huge changes overnight. But we are, over time, I think, if we have these conversations, going to move towards something that is better and fairer and incentivises the sorts of behaviours that we want to see in our research. Because ultimately, as I say, it's in our interest as human beings that this research is of high quality, and that includes all of those at universities. And maybe the existence of the fear of scandals can actually be quite a positive driver in changing some of these behaviours. But yeah, good question, thanks.
We have a couple more minutes. Do we have another question online? Yes. Could you put up the mic, please, so you can hear Nicola?
So hopefully you can hear me now. So this is a question from Angie Boniface, who asks, do you see the role of libraries and librarians in supporting these more qualitative evaluation assessments for their institutions?
That's a really nice question, because librarians are very much involved in supporting quantitative assessments. At the moment, they are the ones who supply the citation data from SciVal and journal impact test factors from the old journal citation reports. I used to be involved in that myself. So is there a role for them in these more qualitative forms of assessment? Certainly, because they are great advocates for researchers and supporting researchers in all sorts of practices that perhaps go beyond their use of the library. We're seeing that with open research. Librarians are often the ones who are driving those sorts of behaviours. I think we're starting to see it in terms of research integrity. I know at Loughborough University, where I work, we had librarians involved in the development of a new mechanism for assessing the particularly kind of arts and humanities research from our researchers. So supporting those conversations that needed to be had, understanding the kind of frameworks like scope, supporting the conversations that need to be had to ultimately design and develop alternative approaches to research assessment. So I can certainly see a role for librarians there, given their skill set and given their relationships with the research community.
So we've got time, I think, one more question. There's a questioner in the middle here. If you could get the mic. This will have to be the last question. Tea and coffee await.
Thank you very much. Henry Spielberg from BMJ, and thank you, Elizabeth, for a great talk. Also, thanks for the mention of BMJ Impact Analytics as well.
You're welcome.
Just a kind of our request for a bit of a comment, really. With the encouragement to move away from the sort of ranking system for universities, and I can quite understand the benefits of that. What do you think of the risk that even if the formal mechanisms are taken away, that it's almost human nature that there will still be some informal moves to make value judgments on different universities? I mean, it could almost seem idealistic to expect that all universities would be seen as equal. You say, what's the purpose of evaluation and assessment? But it's kind of fairly inherent that there'll be some form of benchmarking or gauging how institutions stack up against each other. How do you think that could be dealt with?
really good question. And of course, that's the big fear, that if we move away from quantitative forms of assessment, we're just left with opinion and nuance and all the problems that I outlined around peer review, essentially, bias and so on, and kind of senior white males in smoke-filled rooms, sort of approach to assessing researchers and research institutions. I think the answer, as I said, there is no truth when it comes to trying to identify these things. There may well be a need for institutions to help understand their own performance in particular domains, in which case we can look at benchmarking alternatives to rankings. But rankings are used to benchmark, but they're not always particularly helpful. There are other much better ways of benchmarking that are fairer, and move away from rankings towards profiles. So you can see that we have strengths here, we have perhaps opportunities to develop here, and those profiles can be perhaps more cluster-based, a bit like, I don't know if you're familiar with the knowledge exchange framework in the UK, but that groups like institutions together. So you've got all the very research intensives, you've got those who are more teaching focused, and it kind of benchmarks institutions against like institutions on a range of indicators showing their strengths and their weaknesses. So there are other ways of doing that job, and I think for most assessments, a combination of qualitative and quantitative is always going to be involved in developing the most fit for purpose form of assessment. I don't think there are many assessments where a purely quantitative approach is the ideal. So it's really a matter when we're thinking about responsible assessment of how we can marry those two together. To what extent should it be quantitative, and what is the qualitative element? So the More Than Our Rank initiative, for example, is a qualitative statement around institutions' kind of activities and ambitions and achievements, which can complement quite nicely some of the data that you might see in rankings. We don't need the ranking, but some of that data. And so you've got this both a qualitative and a quantitative approach, bearing in mind that not everything that counts could be counted. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to draw it to a close there, because I think, Elizabeth, you've given us an amazing amount of food for thought, and I think the questions brought out some really interesting issues as well. So it's a fantastic start to the conference, and I think these things will be talked about over the next couple of days. So it just leaves me to ask everyone to join me in thanking Elizabeth for a fantastic talk. And I believe tea and coffee are outside.